Passengers aboard West Caribbean Airways Flight 708 clung to their seats as their McDonnell Douglas MD-82 was battered by storms. Then, the unthinkable happened. The aircraft began to plummet. This was no ordinary turbulence. The plane was falling, plunging through dark clouds at a staggering 12,000 feet per minute. In the cockpit, confusion reigned. The pilots scrambled desperately to save their aircraft, their lives, and the lives of the 158 passengers and crew on board. But this tragedy was not simply a story of bad weather. It was a tale of neglect, corruption, and human error, factors that would come to define the fate of Flight 708. A summer night in 2005, on a humid August evening, 152 passengers boarded Flight 708 in Panama City. Their destination? Martinique in the French West Indies. For these travelers, nearly all French citizens returning home from a holiday in Panama, should have been a straightforward 3-hour journey. Yet, behind the scenes, cracks were forming. Captain Omar Opa, a seasoned pilot with 6,000 flight hours, and his first officer, David Moose, were working under extraordinary pressure. Financial instability had gripped West Caribbean Airways. The airline hadn't paid its crew in months, leaving them juggling second jobs and mounting stress. Captain Opa himself had recently opened a restaurant just to support his family. This dire situation extended to flight operations. Pilots struggled to fuel their planes, pleading with refuelers who doubted they'd ever see payment. Safety violations were rampant. The airline had overworked its crew, skipped essential training, and even sanctioned overweight takeoffs. For the passengers, the full scope of this chaos was hidden, but soon, they would face its devastating consequences. Into the skis, delayed by 2 hours, Flight 708 finally lifted off in the early hours of the morning. As the MD-82 climbed into the darkness, the strain on the aircraft became evident. Heavy with passengers, cargo, and fuel, the plane climbed slowly to its cruising altitude of 31,000 feet. Storms loomed ahead. The pilots, using weather radar, identified violent cloud formations, their screens glowing with ominous bands of red and amber. They requested a course change, and later, a climb to 33,000 feet to avoid the turbulence. But here lay a critical mistake. With the plane already near its performance limits due to its weight and anti-icing systems, siphoning engine power, climbing higher was a dangerous gamble. The crew didn't consult performance tables that would have warned them. Flight 708 couldn't safely reach 33,000 feet. Struggling at the edge as the aircraft climbed, its engines strained. The autopilot, set to maintain a specific climb rate, pitched the nose higher and higher. This caused the plane to slow dangerously, but the tired and stressed pilots failed to recognize the signs. When they finally leveled off at 33,000 feet, the MD-82 was already operating at the edge of its capabilities. The anti-icing system, critical in the freezing conditions, further reduced engine power. Faced with the conflicting need for both speed and safety, the pilots turned the system on and off intermittently. Each time it was engaged, the engine struggled, and the plane slowed further. Meanwhile, the autopilot worked to keep the plane at altitude, pitching the nose higher to compensate for the lack of speed. This created more drag, slowing the plane even more, a vicious cycle. The final descent be the time the MD-82 reached a nose pitch of 7 degrees, far beyond its safe aerodynamic limits, it was doomed. The loss of speed and lift left the aircraft unable to stay in the air. The pilots, distracted by a momentary cabin visit and unaware of their critical position, didn't act in time. What followed was catastrophic. The plane, starved of lift, entered an aerodynamic stall, and began its final, uncontrolled descent toward the Venezuelan landscape below. A tragedy of error. Story of Flight 708 is a chilling reminder of how systemic failures can cascade into disaster. Neglect, financial mismanagement, and lapses in safety protocols combined with human exhaustion to create an irrecoverable situation. This was more than an accident, it was a preventable tragedy that claimed 160 lives. When the aircraft reached its cruising altitude, it encountered an alarming paradox. Maintaining a slower speed required more thrust than flying faster. This phenomenon, called being behind the drag curve, meant the plane needed maximum thrust just to stay aloft at 33,000 feet. With no extra power available, the pilots faced an inescapable reality: the aircraft could not maintain this altitude. Finally acknowledging the situation, the captain disengaged the autopilot and began a descent to 31,000 feet. This was the first correct action in a series of prior missteps. However, as the plane descended through 31,700 feet, an altitude alert sounded. The captain pulled back on the control column to level off, but at that exact moment, a sudden gust of wind from below struck the aircraft. This marked the beginning of a catastrophic sequence. The gust increased the angle at which air hit the wings, disrupting the smooth airflow into the engines. Turbulent air replaced the steady stream, causing engine thrust to plummet instantly. With less thrust, the plane's speed dropped further, creating a vicious cycle. Slower speed led to steeper angles of attack, worsening the turbulence. In the cockpit, the control columns vibrated violently, a clear warning of an impending aerodynamic stall. This critical condition occurs when the wings can no longer generate lift due to disrupted airflow. The correct response? Push the nose down to restore smooth airflow over the wings. But the captain did the opposite. Panicking, he pulled the nose up, defying standard training. This action deepened the stall and sent the plane into an uncontrolled descent. Tragically, Western Caribbean Airways training program did not cover high-altitude stall recovery, leaving the captain ill-prepared. The 21-year-old first officer, fully aware of the stall, twice warned the captain, but his warnings were ignored. Too inexperienced to assert control over his senior, he watched as the situation spiraled further out of control. Now descending at a terrifying rate of over 5,000 feet per minute, the plane faced a new problem. Turbulent air behind the wings was striking the tail. The tail, essential for pulling the nose down during stall recovery, was effectively useless in this disrupted airflow. Even if the captain had acted correctly, the elevator on the tailplane lacked the aerodynamic flow needed to regain control. In his desperation, the captain inadvertently worsened the situation. While gripping the control column, he accidentally engaged the trim switches, tilting the horizontal stabilizer further upward. This increased drag, reduced speed, and steepened the descent. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, terrified passengers endured deafening noises, violent shaking, and erratic engine behavior. Outside, the plane plummeted through the sky. The ground proximity warning system triggered as the aircraft fell below 2,500 feet, but it was too late. Moments later, Flight 708 struck the ground. There were no survivors.